going? I guess I have to call some names. Vince Mamano. Vince Mamano, listen to your favorite panel, favorite topic. Let's go. Commissioner Kehoe, can we get going? Who are we missing? Our executive director. We're missing a lot. Well, we'll just start and they'll have to catch up with us. So, Rima, we call the... Okay, let's get going. So, that was a great opening panel, and we're due up now for our second great panel of the day. We have just a little bit of a schedule change here where Richie from Daimler was not able to join us in person, so I believe we have him queued up on the phone. And the wonders of modern technology, we're going to be able to see the presentations. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So Richie, are you on the line?
I am here. Thank you.
Okay, the microphone is yours.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the Tri-States Commission. I apologize I'm not able to make it out today due to a family event, so I appreciate the flexibility. I look forward to working with the Commission, though, in the future, and hopefully the presentation that I give today gives a little bit of a background on what we're about at Daimler Trucks and sort of the direction we're taking for transportation in the commercial vehicle area. So really briefly, a little bit about myself. I'm the manager of engineering safety, and my role is really to ensure safety for testing and deployment when it comes to crash avoidance technologies, as well as automation. So that means active safety, that means the autonomous program that we have, all related. And so I interface quite a bit with the federal government and also with all 50 states here in the U.S. So it's quite interesting getting to see the different angles and different priorities from all the different organizations and agencies. So I'm based in Washington, D.C., where the federal side is, of course. But again, I hope to be able to make it out in the future and meet everyone face-to-face and have more of a discussion on what we're about. So with that, I can get started really quickly on the presentation. If I could go to the next page, please. And, you know, a little bit about us as Daimler, in case everyone is not familiar. We are a global company that is comprised of various different brands. You know, on the truck side, we're Freightliner and Western Star. We also have Thomas-built school buses and also Detroit, which is the engines and transmissions. We have sister companies in Mercedes-Benz, AMG, and, you know, ride-sharing organizations like Car2Go, and sort of transit organizational companies like Movil. So Movil does a lot of organization of how you would transition with like buses, and of course automation is going to play a role into that. So quite a big organization, but specifically today I'll be focused on Daimler Trucks. So we go to the next slide, page 3, please. We are comprised of those brands above, and I should mention that we do have a lot of interface with our passenger vehicle side in Mercedes. So we're heavily tied together in terms of technology, in terms of our strategy, and also resources. So even though you see the different brands, we actually all work very closely together. I think that's a benefit for us since we're a global company to have the resources around the world. So specifically at Daimler Trucks, we belong to the Daimler Truck organization. As I mentioned before, there's a passenger car organization and there's a Daimler Truck organization. We're part of the truck organization. Our chief executive officer is Mr. Roger Nielsen. He became CEO last year. We have we actually have over 14,000 employees in the United States. although we're headquartered in Portland, Oregon, we have facilities all across the country, manufacturing mostly, and our R&D happens in Portland with our proving ground over in Madras, Oregon, which is about 2 hours, 2.5 hours from our headquarters in Portland. So a couple of notables, we're the market share leader in the U.S. and North America for Class 6 through 8 trucks. In 2015, we had the first licensed automated truck to operate on public roads. It's called the Inspiration. That took place in Nevada. And I'll get into sort of how we've used that to move into the next generation of technology. We also have active safety, which I'll briefly touch upon, but I think maybe not so much the topic today. But we do have a very advanced active safety system called the Detroit Assurance 4.0, which sort of utilizes that technology as we move into the autonomous world. And, you know, we also, if I jump down the list, we also have been testing our level 2 platooning technology for the last couple of years now. So we have a lateral control as well as a longitudinal control, and we're working with our top customers on that. And then what I'll get into most today is that we announced our new automated truck R&D center, and then also electrification for a few of our products. So if you go to the next slide, there are 2 pillars in our organization. Number 1 is safety, and number 2 is efficiency. So everything is centered around these 2 pillars or areas. Whatever technology we develop, whatever business we develop, are highly focused on these 2. And if you go to the next slide, this is slide 5. This is what it means, is that we're looking at automation, electrification, and connectivity. And it's sort of a strategy that we've adopted over the past 3 years. Again, this includes our global organization, so also passenger vehicle, as well as trucks, buses, and vans. So this is a very big strategy that we've been sort of executing on for the past few years. I'm sorry I'm on the phone, but I should add that feel free to ask me questions after. I'll just run through it and give you guys sort of the insights. If you could go to the next slide, page 6. First topic I'll discuss with the commission is the automation part of it. And if you go to the next slide again, this is more of the same in terms of inspiration back in 2015. But what we learned from this activity, this was a research concept, and so we had tested it in Oregon and Nevada, and really understanding the sensor sets, you know, the cameras and the radar systems, the electronic steering gearbox, all these types of technologies that are required when it comes to automation. And we ran this in 2015. We learned from that sort of limitations, and of course, no surprise, 3 years later, that technology is outdated. But that's sort of what started our journey to understanding safety and automation and mobility. That was really the genesis of it. You know, a small bit of that also factored in, as I mentioned before, active safety system, the Detroit Assurance 4.0. So what we learned from this activity propelled us into an actual product, which is on the road today, which came out last year, 2017, in January. And that has an advanced radar system, braking system, and also camera system. And again, that's extracted from just research on the automation side. And so if you go to the next slide, page 8, you know, the Inspiration product carries also into what I also mentioned earlier was our platooning work, which we also refer to it as pairing. The reason why we refer it to pairing is because we only are looking at 2 trucks at the moment. And there's multiple reasons for that. There's a practicality reason for it in terms of managing the trucks in this platoon fashion. There's also traffic issues when you have longer trains of trucks, where 2 is just easier when you have vehicle cut-ins. You know, all the environment that changes is just easier with 2. Also, there's a cybersecurity aspect of it with 2 trucks and handling that. So, of course, cybersecurity is a big issue we definitely take that seriously and something that we're constantly researching as it evolves. There's really no 100% solution, and we recognize that. So it's all about evolving as the technology evolves and understanding, the threats that are out there. So when we're talking about platooning, we have three areas that we're focusing on. Number one is safety. So that is really having a coordinated braking system. That's really the basis of our platooning. It uses DSRC, V2V. It has the ability to connect the braking systems to each other. So we can achieve stopping times, reaction times of 0.2 to 0.3 seconds. The human being, 1 second max in an optimal situation for reacting on the brakes is achievable. And then you also get like brake delays and things like that for the system to engage. So with our platooning system, it's a proprietary system. We develop it all in-house. We don't use suppliers because we feel like integration in this safety area is critical. When you can really have validation from beginning to end and have it on the test track, have it in the factory, all the manufacturing, we need to have it all in-house. And this is, again, the reason why we have a proprietary system. And that's the direction that we're going as a company. So for active safety, for automation, these are all proprietary, internal to us, and utilizing our global resources. So if I continue on the safety side, there's a reduction in driver fatigue. That's the main idea for platooning when you're following so closely. We have a level 2 system. We go to connectivity. There's a lot of infrastructure integration that we'd like to achieve. So using DSRC currently in our test trucks, we would love to have further discussions with the states in terms of how we could apply that to the infrastructure side also, because we believe there's a lot of safety benefits that are associated with that, as well as efficiency gains that we can get. So V2V adds this other additional dimension, which we feel is very important when it comes to enhanced mobility. And then, of course, the third and final aspect of pairing our platooning is a lower emissions footprint, lower operating costs, and really a greater range when you have these trucks sort of following closely behind each other. So if we go to the next page, maybe just page 9, just really quickly here, 45% of braking distance depends on human perception and reaction, and 38% of that braking distance can be reduced by coordinated braking using the DSRC. So you're removing the human component of it. And if you just look at, I won't go through in detail on this, but if you just look at the graph here, it just shows removal of that human component, and you can achieve a much shorter reaction and braking time. So slide 10, we are serious about platooning, but there's also a lot of safety risks that are associated with that. So we've had discussions with California CHP, Oregon. We have not discussed in depth yet with Washington, but we'd love to start those discussions as well. But there are a lot of technical challenges when it comes to this lower level of automation. When it comes to cut-ins, emergency braking scenarios, maneuvers, there's environmental interference when it comes to DSRC and tunnels, where you could have breakouts in the communication, or cutouts, I should say. And really the functional safety part of that. So the components, are they able to be, is there redundancy? How much redundancy do we need? Because when you're at these close following distances, clearly the law of physics apply here. There's a lot of mass and inertia involved. So we're testing actively now on our track in Madras, Oregon. We've also tested actively in Texas, in Uvalde, because it's a bigger oval and we need to understand more high-speed maneuvers. Our track in Oregon is quite small, so we can't achieve some of the freeway speeds that we would like to. So we go to both locations, and then we're actively testing on Oregon public roads at the moment. Actually, probably today, I think we're actually running some tests as well. So the next slide, page 11, I think this, as well as other automation features, is critical for us to establish state partnerships working with organizations like yourselves, because it's not possible for us to carry this alone. I think we definitely need to have a collaborative environment where we're looking at the different laws and policy, following distances in the cases of platooning, but then, of course, AV legislation and policy that enables the safe testing and also eventual the deployment. So for us, we love to have close relationships with the agencies, with the regulators, with agencies, with public safety departments. We feel that has to be the only way, and we like to be transparent with all these organizations. So, coming in and presenting on our data and having discussions about where we're actually at. We love that. We love having also agencies visiting us in Portland at our test track. So that's something that we actually plan on doing later on this year. And so we want to have that type of engagement. As again, that's the only way to really realize this technology. So finally, if we go to page 12 for platooning, testing is key. Safety is our priority. So we need to keep doing this with integration. So let me move on to the next topic really quick here. Is next page 13. And, as we have platooning and pairing, we move to automation. I think that's sort of the path that we're taking. So inspiration, active safety, platooning. Now we announced on June 6th that we're opening an automated truck R&D center. And, the reason for this is that we need to understand this evolution. We need to have a dedicated resource for that. And so the reason why we're looking at high automation, so we're looking at level 4 for commercial vehicles, is that we believe that striving towards highly automated technology will accelerate the evolution of safety technologies that will reduce crashes and save lives. So we learned that from inspiration, that when we take these big leaps, we don't know if we'll be able to achieve it, but along the way, we'll find out new technology, we'll find out new methods, processes that are going to increase the safety on our trucks with the whole goal of reducing crashes and saving lives. If you go to the next slide, page 14, I think that's sort of carrying on with this path. And you guys all know well the levels of automation for SAE. And so, what we need to do as an OEM is develop a 100% reliable solution. Like, it can't be 90%, 95%, 99%. It needs to be a 100% in our view. And this is why we're also doing this in-house as proprietary work. And having this deep validation process, as we're all learning, we have a specialized division, global Daimler, called PVE, Product Validation and Engineering. Their sole purpose is to validate technology and to test it over and over before we release it as a product. In addition to that, we have test fleets, the largest test fleet in North America, which we use. It's our own fleet that helps us with validating the products on the road and on the track. So we take all this together and combine that to really develop the technology. That's what we're doing now. We also need to have acceptance from the public and confidence from our customers. I mean, that is the number one thing. Without the public acceptance, without our customers, without working with regulatory agencies and governments, state governments, federal governments, it just isn't possible for automation to really make that next leap in the commercial vehicle area. So that's why that regulatory framework becomes important to us. And at the end of the day, safety is going to dictate our time frames. So we haven't announced any time frames for releasing any automated truck because the safety side of it will dictate it. When we've gone through the processes, the functional safety tests, the test tracks, we're going to be data-driven. We're going to be focused on collecting data and really understanding the performance of the sensors and the human factors aspect of it initially when we're testing as well. So our timeline really is going to be focused on this validation part of it, the safety side. Slide 15, just a little bit of history. back in 2014, we had the Future Truck in Germany. And then, of course, in 2015, I mentioned Inspiration. And then we sort of moved towards this more autonomous automation area with Platooning in Japan and the U.S. in 2018. We have an interesting project for automated snow removal. So we have some trucks that remove snow in an highly automated sense, level 4. And so that's sort of a pilot program that we have, just testing the technology in a very closed environment. So if you go to the next slide, slide 16. I think one thing that we'll be the first to admit that you see a lot of demos out there in automation, but we feel that it's a long ways to go to be an actual viable product. And that includes a lot of practical aspects, like reliability, integration into a customer processes, the whole logistical part of it, and then reduction of crashes, fatalities, and you're talking about weather and all regions and streets. So there's a lot of different components, not just a demo that you might see on the road, in perfect weather conditions. So for us, we take all these different aspects into consideration. And of course, there's a lot of things we don't know and situations that we don't know yet. And so that requires this measured approach as we're sort of moving forward by establishing this automated truck R&D center. So if you go to the next slide, page 17, there's a lot of components that are involved technically. You always hear about the artificial intelligence aspect of automation, and for sure that is a core component of what we're working on. Motion controllers, motion planning, that is critical to the success of automation. And, a couple of things I'll touch upon on this slide is like you have sensor fusion, this whole perception area of understanding the environment and taking the sensors and fusing them together so that the data is analyzed together on board and calculated so that the system can be fully aware of its surroundings. And then we're looking at things like the computing power in the vehicle. Requires a lot of computing power. I think on trucks, you have a lot more space, in the back cab area if you have a sleeper cab. There's some space for high-powered computers, things like that'll be different from a passenger car side. But nonetheless, you're always looking at space, you're looking at power. You're also looking at connectivity. Is there any connectivity on it? The IT back end, things of that nature that need to be considered when you have an automated vehicle out there that relate to something like a vehicle control center. So that's just a concept that we're looking at is do we have a VCC for monitoring these systems, and of course really on the redundancy and safety side of it. So it's tough. This is a very difficult task. We are not shy about saying that there are multiple challenges that are out there. We also see it far out. We see really a level 4 system far away, and will require years of R&D, years of testing to really be at that point. Now, one thing I should add is that we're focused on highway right now. So we're looking at just a freeway scenario, that operational domain. But still, there are challenges with that because you're talking about high speed, high closing rates with other vehicles and objects on the road. And as with anything in life, there's randomness to it. So there's randomness to streets and arterial roads and urban environments. There's also randomness to highways, stop vehicles, emergency vehicles, construction zones that come up, on the fly, overnight, really TBD. So very difficult thing. If you go to the next slide, page 18, this is our headquarters in Portland, Oregon. We'd love to have the commission visit us. As we're building this new R&D center, we've started that already, and we're actively hiring. We already have core engineers. We have 1,000 engineers in Portland, Oregon, and we're working on technologies like automation, electrification, connectivity, chassis, a lot of different technologies and a lot of different projects that are happening at Cortland. And so the three things I'll point out is that there's synergies with the Mercedes side. I think that's important to note because when we're talking about VMT globally, with passenger vehicles and trucks, we can amass a lot of VMT and understand a lot about the different scenarios and use cases across the world. The other thing is that this is a global R&D center, so we're incorporating Germany and India, and so we work around the clock, basically. But those three areas and regions will all be involved with this automated truck R&D project. And so the other thing that I do want to bring up is that we recognize and are empathetic to this workforce issue. So that's the other reason for the Automated Truck Research and Development Center is, the impact to workforce, impact to the jobs, truck drivers. And so I think our goal is to work with these organizations to understand their needs also. I think the whole idea for us is supplementing the current truck driver shortage, but also improving, enhancing the lives of these drivers. And I think as technology evolves, I think that's a conversation that we'll continue to have. We actually started a new organization in D.C. Called the PTIO. So we are partnered with Uber, Waymo, Toyota, Ford, FedEx, these organizations to sort of get the messaging and strategy here in D.C. about workforce and really work with these organizations to understand their needs and, to adapt our technology to those needs. I think at the end of the day, we're looking for similar things. We're looking to enhance lives, save lives, reduce injuries, increase efficiency. So if you go to the next page, this is the final slide for automation. As I mentioned, as the level of automation increases, the role of the driver will reflect that change, will reflect those improved capabilities. We think, again, it's going to be slow, and it's going to take some time. And again, that's why we need to work with all the different organizations. So everything needs to be considered across the board on the table is what we're looking at. The next topic that we're focusing on, so next page is 20, is electrification. I guess, should I pause if you have any questions? Because we're kind of moving down the different topics.
This is Fran. We're going to have to pick up a little pace here just because we went over on our first panel. So if I can ask you maybe to summarize your next two, and then we'll come back. We typically do the questions at the end of the panel, so we might call you back and put you on at that point. But if we can just maybe wrap up the next two topics with the overview, would be great.
Yep, and the next two are actually quite short. So if we could just skip to page 23. So we announced also on June 6th 3 vehicles, electrified vehicles, the E-Cascadia, the EM2, and the Thomasville school bus we call the Julie. So those 3 are sort of the centerpiece for our electrification plan. The new Cascadia, the one in the middle there, will have a 250-mile range, and we'll be able to achieve an 80% charge in under 90 minutes. That's our goal. The EM2 has a 230-mile range and 80% charge under 60 minutes. So if you go to slide 24, these are the applications initially that we're looking at, is sort of this port to intermodal transfer, daily trips. If there's a hub with a charger, there's a range that we can achieve with these types of products. So pickup and delivery, port to staging lot, those are really the 2 scenarios initially with these trucks. So slide 25 is, let's jump to connectivity now. Let me skip to 26 here. So the third pillar is looking at connectivity And, we have a telematics system that's out today called Detroit Connect, and that encompasses virtual technician, remote updates, and this analytics package. So you look at slide 27, what that means is that our customers and us can capture data off these vehicles for fuel economy performance, understanding faults within the system, and over-the-air updates, and then finally understanding safety and getting the reporting and sort of safety events from that. So let me just conclude then. So thank you very much for the time again, and look forward to the questions.
Thank you. So now we're going to go to Chris Shimoda, one of our rising shining stars in the state of California, if you ask me. So, Chris.
Your introductions are always so great, but so hard to live up to, Fran. So thank you for that. And thank you to the Tri-State Commissions for the invitation to present today. I am Chris Shimoda, Vice President of Government Affairs for the California Trucking Association, and I'm a little disappointed Richie's not here in person. I put a Freightliner truck on the front of my presentation just for him. So, Richie, if you can see that was for you. And
Thank you.
Just wanted to present just a little bit of data for those that are not familiar with freight. I live in it every day, so I forget sometimes to just sort of give the baseline. So trucks, really play this essential role in the goods movement economy. Here in the state of California, there was some data that came out from the administration that said, we estimate in the state of California that freight-dependent industries account for about a third of the state's economy and jobs. And so within that freight industry, trucks are really the key cog in the system. When you look at the amount of cargo that travels by the various modes, be it a steamship, a railroad, as well as air cargo, trucks do about, give or take 3/4 to 80% of all of that cargo. If you look at cargo that travels by multiple modes, so by plane to a truck or by intermodal rail to a truck, it even increases by a few percentage points. The industry is also a major fee payer into the highway system, and here in California, I'm happy to report that the CTA did support last year's infrastructure funding package that did include increases to both the diesel, excise, and sales tax, and you'll see that nationally from our affiliate back in DC, the American Trucking Associations, also advocating for an increase to fuel taxes to pay for new infrastructure. And this is just one of my favorite data points and graphics here. For those that are not familiar with the trucking industry, it's not like there's 20 major corporations that control the industry. It's really driven by small business, mom and pop style operations. The statistics say that 97% of trucking companies run 20 or fewer trucks. And so this is really a grassroots sort of small business driven industry. My membership, for instance, I interact with the owner, who's also the dispatcher. His wife does the books. It's that sort of family driven operation. And then NPR did a really interesting breakdown of some Bureau of Labor Statistics data a few years ago that said that truck driver is actually the most common job in 29 of the 50 states that they looked at. And this is the map of where truck driver is the most common for 2012. And so you'll see in 2012, Washington and California was the most common job. And then 2014, software engineer took over in Washington, but it became the #1 most common job in Oregon. So, along the West Coast, we think of everyone as working for, tech, but it's really, blue collar industries like trucking that still provide a big majority of these jobs. Okay, so as far as trends, I'm glad Richie went first. I figured it was, going to talk a lot about automation and electrification, and I spent a lot of my time discussing those sort of things and environmental issues. But I really wanted to bring to the commission, since the unique role you play in transportation policy, what's on the minds of the folks who are actually operating out there today, in the real world. And our national affiliate, the research wing known as ATRI, does a annual survey of the top 10 issues within the industry. It goes out to a variety of truck fleets and owner-operators and others. And this is this year's industry issue summary. And I think amongst the top issues, it's very interesting that there's some stuff that I think I'm going to try to tie it together here. That really relates to sort of fundamental transportation planning and policy. And so the driver shortage, as Richie mentioned, we'll dive into that. Transition within the industry from, we used to document hours on paper logs, we're moving to electronic systems currently. Truck parking, and then just, general infrastructure investment and congestion. And so these are two screen grabs from front page news on both the Washington Post and the New York Times in the first quarter of this year. And it's been a topic of discussion within the industry for a long time that we have a driver shortage, but it's now starting to sort of seep into the general consciousness. I have been seeing more and more articles and earnings calls about how major shippers are saying this is the worst freight market they've ever encountered. They're not being able to find trucks, and shipping costs are going up. And that's in large part due to just a lack of truck drivers. And the American Trucking Association estimates that we've got a whole slate of baby boomer drivers moving out of the industry. The average driver age is 55 today, which is pretty astounding. As well as the increasing demand. We need to add 50,000 to 100,000 drivers every year just to keep up right now. And so we've got a pretty major issue that is now, it's not just the industry saying, hey, we got this driver shortage. It's really starting to show up with our customers. Add to that, we've had some changes, as I had mentioned, in the way that drivers document their hours. And for those that don't know, the allowable hours that a driver can operate are actually regulated by a federal agency known as the FMCSA. There's breaks in the middle of shifts, as well as breaks between driving shifts that are mandated for safety purposes. And then also, every state, and I can say specifically California, also has labor and employment laws that mandate both, paid and unpaid meal and rest breaks. And so the bottom line that I'm trying to get around here is that drivers must take breaks. Doesn't matter if you're in the middle of the 405 freeway, if you come up against one of these limits, you're going to need to find a way to get off the freeway and park the truck somewhere to take that break. And so, one of the other impacts of this is back in the days of paper logs, it's not something anyone like to openly talk about, but if you were 5 minutes away from a destination, you may fudge a little bit on that paper log and say it was 5 minutes before. No one was any the wiser. But as we move to electronic logs, you're really going to see, sort of strict recording of where the driver was at a given time leading into a break. And so the estimate is that just simply by switching from paper to electronic logs, we're going to lose about 3 to 7% of the driver capacity just from that, non-ability to fudge. And I do say that the industry, by and large, at least, the Trucking Association members do support this transition. It is going to be a more accurate, more safe method of recording, but it is a reality that there's also sort of this reduction in capacity as we switch over. And then so, truck parking is now climbing back up the list of industry concerns because of sort of this lack of flexibility with electronic logs. When the driver needs to take a break, either for safety or labor and employment purposes, you need to have somewhere to go. And so, we really do need safe, appropriately zoned areas for drivers to take these mandated breaks. But, despite a lot of discussions in recent years, this continues to be an issue. And I'm sorry to have to highlight some bad data, not to beat up on our home states here, but I did pull some truck parking data from the Bureau of Transportation Statistics. They publish the metrics of total available spaces compared to some activity numbers. In this case, it's how many spaces do you have or how much truck traffic you have. And unfortunately, our home state of California came in second to last, not dead last. Rhode Island is worse than us, and Hawaii has no data, so they're disqualified. But yeah, it continues to be an issue. If there's not either a public or private truck parking space for one of these drivers to occupy, they're going to have to go somewhere else, be it, again, hopefully an appropriately zoned local or, city or county street or road, whatever the case may be. But, this is something that, thankfully, at least on the California side, we're working with Caltrans right now on a truck parking advisory committee. We've gotten a bunch of our members to try to work with Caltrans staff to identify some actual sites that would be appropriate to do, some sort of pilot program to increase truck parking. So we are trying to work on it right now. Okay, and finally, just highlighting congestion continues to be an issue. Here in California, we're home to 5 of the top 50 worst freight bottlenecks, according to annual research done by the American Transportation Research Institute. As the Commission is already aware, demands on the system from freight are forecasted to increase in the coming years. To try to tie all of these things together is that, I'd say some of these things that we've really talked about intellectually are starting to seep out into the real world, and these are all sort of symptoms of increasing demand. So, we're starting to see a driver shortage because there's more demand than we have drivers. The costs are increasing. The need for truck parking is increasing. Congestion is going to worsen. And, we have a saying in the industry, if you got it, a truck brought it. And I'm not going to embarrass anybody by show of hands, but who's ordered something off the internet in the last week? I'm sure everybody has. And so, I just really want to say that, we are a demand-based industry, and this is all, we're all sort of playing into this increase in demand for what the freight industry does. And so, the positive sign of this is that, it really is a sign of how good the economy is doing and increased prosperity, that there's all this economic activity driving the freight. But there are some stress signs there that I would just try to leave transportation planning and policy agencies with, that if we're going to be able to meet these future demands, we really need to do planning and investment at appropriate levels to meet that growth that is going to happen. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris, and we'll come back with some questions, so don't go away. So next, we're going to hear from Ann Goodchild. So Ann?
Thank you, Fran. And thank you, Rima, for the invitation. I'm Ann Goodchild, professor of civil and environmental engineering at the University of Washington and director of the Supply Chain Transportation and Logistics Center that is housed there. I'm also a proud Berkeley alum, so it's always nice to be back in the Bay Area. I serve as the Freight Group Chair for the Transportation Research Board, have done so for the last 3 years. And I'm going to speak today specifically about one of the initiatives I've led called the Urban Freight Lab. So I'm focused on urban freight, but my work generally touches on the broader scope of freight transportation. Some of the issues have already been mentioned today. Urban freight is a little different because it's the challenges of shared space are exacerbated. The urban area, unlike a warehouse that's specifically designed by Amazon to operate for them, the urban environment is one that is shared by many users, operated by many entities, public and private. And so the challenges there cannot be solved by trucking companies alone. They cannot be solved by cities alone. And so the Urban Freight Lab has been our initiative to collaborate in a really significant and meaningful way to try to address the challenges of urban freight. It's not, I would also argue that urban freight is not a system that we've planned for. We know, that freight moves around in cities, but we haven't thought about it as a system, and we don't have, as a general comment, high quality existing knowledge or data about how that system works. And that limits our ability to improve it if we don't have good data about what's going on and how it's working now. So, as I'm sure you are all aware, online shopping is increasing at a fast pace. And this just shows the percentage of retail that's actually e-commerce. And I will argue that cities really aren't ready for the change that this brings to the transportation system. And that is exacerbated by other ongoing changes like the increase in ride hailing and the use of TNCs, as we've talked about earlier. So there's a 20% growth in e-commerce would result in a doubling of deliveries in the next 5 years. So if you think about how do cities accommodate those deliveries? Where will they happen? How long do they take? How many are there? What kinds of vehicles are those in? Those are questions we need to be able to answer, or at least have good data to discuss. And we aren't ready. We don't have the capacity to manage those without other changes. One of the other features of urban freight is that it is bringing goods specifically to consumers. And so some of our strategies with managing freight are to separate and isolate that freight as much as possible from residential areas. Right? That is a very sensible strategy. However, urban freight is bringing packages to homes, bringing food to restaurants, taking waste away from coffee shops, and that cannot be separated from where people live. So we have to think about how this is supporting the quality of life we want to provide in cities, and how we do that in a way that's economically efficient for the companies that are doing that work. So, we can't, although it seems that some cities want to approach it as a sort of, well, we can ban large trucks. That does not allow the sort of urban ecosystem to work, for coffee shops to have coffee for you, for restaurants to have wine. We need to bring those goods closer to you. And actually, if we want to support less SOV travel, we have to have more density of stores. If we want people to be able to walk to the store, or we want people to live car-free, we may expect an increase in truck traffic and deliveries, right? If you don't have a car to go to the grocery store, you have to have a truck bring that to your house. So we may actually, in the long run, anticipate growth in deliveries as a way of supporting more sustainable, less car-dependent cities. So there's a strong interaction between those two trends. And practically speaking, we don't have the curb space at the moment to accommodate the amount of growth we've already seen. And the existing infrastructure we have is insufficient. And as a transportation engineer, I would argue that we witness a failure of planning to accommodate even the existing vehicles we have. Here's an example, right? The CVLZ is not long enough for the vehicle, so he has to extend his ramp into the pedestrian crosswalk. I know that in this case, the CVLZ is just not long enough, and so that disrupts pedestrian traffic and forces pedestrians to walk in an unsafe zone in order to cross the street. He's just trying to deliver food to this restaurant and do so in a way that is practical for him. So growth in the curb, there's also much discussion now about increase in TNCs and an increased demand for curb use, right? Because we have more drop-off and pickup activity in Seattle. We have more transit. We want to provide safe and separated bike lanes for cyclists to encourage that mode. We have a lot of demand for the curb at the same time that we have increasing explicitly freight demand for that curb. And that presents a big challenge and requires us to think about how we use curbs in a new way. So the Urban Freight Lab that I started about 2 years ago is a partnership with the City of Seattle, Department of Transportation, and private sector firms. And by partnership, I mean we have private sector firms that pay membership fees to be part of that lab and jointly financially sponsor the research that we do. Our current members are Ford Motor Company, Kroger, UPS, United States Postal Service, Charlie's Produce, Expeditors of International of Washington, Nordstrom. So a range of both carriers and shippers who are funding the lab, giving us the time of senior executives to attend lab meetings, to define research problems collectively, and then oversee the research that we do at the University of Washington to address the problems that they have defined. Those problems are defined collectively. We don't define them as the University of Washington and then go ask people to fund them. We get together and discuss what are the collective and shared research goals that both the public and the private sector care about and want to learn about and want to solve. One of the things we've highlighted through that process is the importance of the final 50 feet. So I think as transportation engineers, we have really thought about the transportation network as the map of roads and nodes, and we've neglected to think about what happens once the vehicle is parked. Because in a lot of cases with personal travel or with transit, that's sort of where our responsibility ends. But with the freight system, especially in an urban environment, the truck driver, we call him a driver, but he spends the vast majority of his time outside the vehicle. He's really making deliveries and using his truck for a small amount of that time. So the truck, unlike transit, where you drop off your passengers and then you move on, and you do that as quickly as possible. We've spent billions of dollars making that act very fast. We've modified vehicles so that you can get in and out faster. The truck sits there while the driver is outside of the vehicle looking for, going up to the 40th floor, finding the destination. And so that activity that happens in the building determines how long that truck sits there for. And he'll move a quarter of a mile to his next destination, and then the truck may wait there for 35 minutes. So that's occupying a lot of our capacity, a lot of our very scarce capacity on the roadway, while he does work outside of his vehicle. So the final 50 feet, we call it, what happens between when he parks and when he gets to his destination? Is there a curb cut? And my picture here is to show you that nobody has thought about how he's supposed to get the stuff out of his truck and take it into the building. The fastest way is to walk across this bike lane, and there's no curb cut on the side. So actually what they often do is walk along the travel lane to the intersection where there's a curb cut, right? Walking essentially in this place that is not engineered for him to walk safely, and then get up on the curb, come back up the curb and into the building. And that is delay. That's causing his truck to sit there longer, and it's deteriorating the capacity of our infrastructure. So this is a new field that we've defined. We focus on curb use, parking, access to buildings. And as a group, we defined 2 goals with the Urban Freight Lab. One is reducing dwell time, which is obviously a good goal for all of us, right? As both the public and the private sector. It uses our capacity, our scarce right-of-way capacity when vehicles are parked there. We want them to do that as quickly as possible. But also as a delivery company, you want your driver to wait as little as possible, right? That increases the capacity of your fleet and the cost effectiveness of your operations. So we have a shared goal that would improve the system for everybody. So we've thought about why it takes as long as it does and how we can improve on dwell time. Our other goal is reducing failed deliveries. So you've seen this picture when you come to your house with the little pieces of paper that tell you they've come twice, and now you're going to have to drive down to Soto and pick it up. Failed deliveries are wasteful, again, for all of us. They are excess trips that we don't want on our system, and they are doubling and tripling the cost of that delivery to the carrier and the retailer eventually. So those are waste, and we want to get rid of those failed deliveries. So how many are there? Are they concentrated in areas, and what can we do to address those is the research that we've been doing. To actually do this work, we've started with a fair amount of data collection. The city of Seattle, which is a very forward-looking, progressive, data savvy city did not have existing publicly available accurate GIS layers of private sector loading and unloading infrastructure. It's not their infrastructure to manage. However, it's a really important part of the freight system. Where are their loading bays? What is the capacity of those? Because if we think about taking loading bays or loading zones off the street, that's where we're going to force those vehicles to go. So we mapped all of those, we've measured them, we now know, and we have a complete inventory of public and private sector infrastructure for the city of Seattle, a particular area that used to be called One Center City, but it's been renamed to something else. And so this is just a map of those locations, and we know things like 87% of the buildings in Seattle city center rely only on the street for loading and unloading. So only 13% of the buildings in downtown Seattle have off-street loading or unloading infrastructure. So if we take away all of the load zones on 2nd Avenue to provide transit access, they will have to go, they will have to go somewhere else. So that helps us in our planning as a city. We have also looked at how long trucks spend at the curb, where they park. Are they parking in CVLZs, or are they parking in passenger load zones, or are they double parking? What we've seen is that they park everywhere. So 53% of trucks parked in passenger load zones. To be fair, about as many passenger cars park in commercial vehicle load zones. So that system, I would, isn't working. It's not working the way we intended it to. And instead of trying to think about how we could force people to behave differently, we want to think about how we can provide a more reasonable solution that people can comply with. I believe people want to comply. So that's 49% of the vehicles in the CVLZs were passenger cars. And so now that we've collected data, we've looked at how people behave, and we've come up with some ideas that we're calling goods trip reduction strategies. One of those was installing common carrier locker systems on the first floor. So most warehouses are one story, right? Because you don't want to move goods up and down stairs or up and down floors. It's very slow. And so a lot of what takes time in these big office towers is a delivery person actually moving up and down the building. So they would much prefer to come in, drop everything off on the first floor. That reduces dwell time, it reduces their time. And common carrier lockers reduce failed deliveries and increase the turn time in those trucks. So we actually installed some, we tested them, we measured how much time savings there was in the Seattle Municipal Tower. You have to overcome a lot of practical obstacles to try to do that, but we did that. And we reduced the dwell time for those trucks waiting on the street by 78%. Which is wonderful and remarkable and good for everybody. The lockers cost money, and some way in the long term, we're now thinking about how that would be supported and where those who would do that work. But there are third-party companies who want to provide that service. And our next step is to do some dynamic management between alleyways and curbs and private loading bays to go back to that idea of the freight infrastructure in a city as a system, and how can we best encourage and allocate that infrastructure so that it supports both the freight community and the city's goals in terms of traffic congestion and revenue generation. So I'd be happy to take any questions. The questions are the best part, so I hope I've given you enough detail to build some questions off of.
Commissioner Gilmetti?
Yeah, I have two questions, one for each of you. Chris, I know there's an airline pilot shortage, and obviously we're having a truck driver shortage. What are the associations doing to try to increase that, or?
Sure. There's currently a congressional proposal to lower the age that you currently have to be to get a interstate commercial driver's license is 21. And so the industry is concerned that we're essentially losing a whole bunch of potential workers by, a lot of folks are locked into their professions. Once they get out of high school, they start deciding what they're going to do. And so there is a proposal to lower that age to 18, that you would be able to get your commercial drivers at least some sort of, learning permit earlier in your career, so that we could try to get some more of those workers. We have active partnerships with the military. There's, troops to truckers programs throughout every state. But, there's really no silver bullet apart from you'll see all sorts of announcements. If you have Sirius XM radio, you're going to hear all sorts of recruitment for truck drivers, and we're seeing like double-digit record pay increases for drivers. It's really the only thing that the companies can really do.
I know the larger the truck, probably the more efficient, for deliveries. You have one driver, you have a large truck. But I recently got back from Italy, and, there's a lot of small little towns, and they all have adapted to either street sweepers that are small or small delivery trucks, et cetera. Is that part of your equation too, converting some of these large trucks to smaller trucks that fit in urban areas?
Yeah, large vehicles, if you have a large load, are, with high, the relationship between fixed and variable costs can often provide the lowest, per unit cost of delivery. And we want to allow the freight delivery system to be cost efficient, right? So we want to allow them to use the vehicle that's the right size. European cities are just fundamentally different, because even the most dense area of New York can accommodate a box truck, and that is not true in the historical center of Rome. So, the environment requires that they use smaller vehicles. But you do see adaptation, where it makes sense in the total cost calculation for a carrier. They use different size vehicles, and I think you're seeing a bit more experimentation with that now. And so particularly in urban areas, the cost of moving one of those vehicles, so if you're going to bring a semi into downtown Seattle, you want to do that at 4 a.m. You want to bring in a big load, and then you don't want to move it. You don't want to stop 10 times with that vehicle. So you want to distribute from that vehicle in a smaller vehicle. So I think, the right application in an urban area for that final mile may be a much smaller vehicle. But we want to allow, where there is a high volume, if we can do that in one trip versus 2 in smaller vehicles, we want to allow that. So I think we don't want to force carriers to behave in a way, as a policy. I think it would be naive for us to tell them what vehicle to use. As a general rule, we're going to have an efficient system where they can make an appropriate choice. But I think there's also, the vast majority of the country is accessible with quite large vehicles, and the number of places where smaller vehicles is required is small. But in those places, you do see change and the choice of other vehicle types. The other thing is with delivery services, Prime Now, 1 hour, 2 hour deliveries, those are made in passenger cars, and that is a big change. We've always had couriers, right? We've always had couriers who have done very fast deliveries on bikes, because that was a nimble vehicle to make, fast and short deliveries in urban areas. And maybe we don't think about them as freight, but those are freight. And we still see, FedEx, I was just up in Juneau, their primary vehicle for the city of Juneau, because volumes are small, is a fairly small vehicle. So there is that adaptation going on, I think.
Commissioner Dunn?
Thank you. Chris, on top of all of the other parade of horribles, from congestion to lack of parking, et cetera, are you also looking at the new Supreme Court decision that came down, redefining independent contractor versus employee in California?
I'm very glad you brought that up, Commissioner.
You're welcome.
It's I think, been described as a watershed decision for the way that workers are classified in the state of California. And specific to trucking, we think that the data is a little fuzzy, but we think approximately 10 to 20% of our driver pool operates as single truck owner operators. These folks have been part of the industry for 70 plus years. If anyone's seen Smokey and the Bandit, there was an owner operator in that movie. So, this is not something that just recently popped up. And with the new test as outlined by that court decision, we are concerned that these owner operators are not going to be able to work in the state of California as independent contractors. They would have to become employees of the firms that they seek to work with. And so if you see disruption from a 3 to 7% change in capacity from, moving from paper logs, if you take 10 to 20% of the capacity out of the system just in California alone or any other state that adopts this test, I think we're in pretty uncharted territory right now. And businesses are still trying to figure out how to adapt to things. But, if there is not some sort of policy shift in the next couple of years, I think you're going to see some real interesting things happening in the market.
So you don't see the legislature taking any action on this one in any short order?
For this particular legislative session, we're not hopeful, though we are still advocating that we take a bit of a timeout to assess really what the impact of that decision was. It was, described by everybody that watches labor and employment law as, unprecedented. And so, the current word is most likely nothing this session, and we only have, a couple of weeks to go. So.
Do we have any more questions? Yes, Commissioner Kehoe.
Thanks, Frank. So your experiment, this is to the professor. Your pilot in Seattle with the common lockers and the other solutions. Can you comment on if Seattle, the city, has done anything to better utilize its curb space? You heard the previous panel say passenger vehicles are too big, be one way to phrase it. And Commissioner Gilmetti talking about the smaller deliveries. Is there some kind of answer there or not? I don't know. And is Seattle taking steps, changing parking regulations, for instance?
Yeah, Seattle is wins awards for parking
Well, I wasn't aware
management. So I think, yes, Seattle is very actively trying to, has changed and thinks a lot about, how do we change the way we use curb lanes to best meet the needs of the city. And I think the general answer is that using the curb lane to store vehicles for long periods of time is not the best use of the right-of-way when you have very scarce right-of-way. So that is certainly on the table, but commercial vehicle use of pickup and drop-off is a high priority use of the curb. What you want, I guess what I would want to say about small vehicles is that what I would want to see happening is the smallest vehicle for the use. So we don't want empty space in vehicles. And I think the point about passenger vehicles being big was that there's just you and a lot of empty space. And so if there is just you, could you have a smaller vehicle and you'd get the same job done and you wouldn't be using up so much of the other capacity. The same is true with freight. If you can fill a full truck, we want that to be in one trip. It is not serving anybody to take that and put it into two vehicles, right? Because then we have two trucks and a total of more road damage or more pollution coming from that activity, more drivers, more cost. So there are times when the largest vehicle that we accommodate is the appropriate vehicle to use. That tends not to be at the very end of the distribution system. By the time goods are getting to you, they're in small sizes. And so the ratio of how far do you want to travel with how much stuff is very different when you're looking at national trade lanes to how do I get from a warehouse in South Seattle to 10 grocery stores. So, or 10, 100 homes. So, the freight industry is very heterogeneous, and there's lots of different solutions that we want to apply at different parts of it. So if small vehicles, if you're a courier and you're delivering 3 packages, what we would want to encourage is the smallest vehicle for that use, but not, I couldn't say as a blanket statement that it was better for the freight industry as a whole to require that only vehicles of less than 16 feet were allowed in cities. Maybe I would not support that.
So what new regulations or ordinances has Seattle implemented that helps manage their parking, their curb space better for these kind of deliveries? If any, I don't know.
Right, none yet.
Okay.
There are several candidate ideas on the table, but I think what happens, what we're trying to avoid is there is a laundry list of ideas, and I think many places they come up with ideas and then they put them in practice. And we wanted to avoid doing that before we really understood what was happening, what the system looked like, and what the pressures were. Because when we do that, we often cause unintended consequences. If we do something like say, no trucks of more than 20 feet in the city, then what we might do is just proliferate the number of vehicles coming into the city, which doesn't meet the goals that we had of reducing congestion or emissions. So what we wanted to do was understand what's currently happening, the diversity and heterogeneity of that, and apply solutions based on data that we are confident are going to be good for not just the city, but also the companies working in that city. Yeah.
Okay, do we have any others? No? Well, a couple of things. One, with all due respect to our freight sector, we only barely scratched the surface here. And we could have had a lot more partners at the table. We focused on the urban challenges and the trucking, but even within those, when Chris talked about our 3 states being at the bottom of those lists in terms of providing truck parking to meet the hours of service, the legal requirements of doing your job, have nothing to do with what Ann was talking about in terms of the truck parking to be able to do your job in terms of completing the task. And I would add to Ann's comment of systems, and I like to use the plural, we're a system of systems and very much codependent within the freight sector. So there's a lot of things that happen that you push here and something else happens over there that was maybe worse than the problem you were trying to solve in the first place. So whether it's our manufacturing community, our rail partners, our port partners, we could spend weeks, and we should. I think we need more Chris's and more Ann's really helping us all understand what's going on and what might be. And if you take the panel that we had previously, we could do the same kind of thing looking at that. We attempted to do a little bit with Richie, but there's so much more in terms of what's going on. So I think for all of us, it just, the e-commerce phenomenon to me is just, we don't begin to understand what's happening in terms of how we all live our lives. I mean, if you just look at the Blue Aprons of the world and, cooking from scratch these days means everybody brings me what those things are. It's different than the old going to the market once a week and figuring out what you're going to do all week. So I would just encourage all of us to pay a lot of attention. Freight is the economy in motion, and I think, clearly in our state has recognized the importance of 1/3 of the jobs, but it's so important, I think, for all of us to figure out where we are and where we can go together. So we don't have any more questions. Oh, we do have a question. Good.
Just one last one. I was curious about, as you were talking about, it's a very it's very heavily weighted on the small business side of things, at least in the freight community. And I was curious about, with your guys' clean air emissions regulations that you're implementing and moving forward with, what kind of incentives or innovative financing mechanisms has the state implemented to support sustaining those small businesses as they have to retrofit their fleets or acquire newer and cleaner, more efficient trucks?
I think it's a huge issue. We have had some incentives, but Chris, you're probably the best to speak to this.
Right. So for the current generation of rules, which is really sort of getting into the cleanest available federal technology, which is the EPA model year 2010, the state has some long-standing programs. One, the Carl Moyer program, which is funded through like tire fees and registration fees, that puts out in the neighborhood of like $150 million a year. So that program has existed since the 90s. In the lead up to the fleet rules, the state also issued a bond. It was part of the Prop 1B bond package in, I believe, 2008, where about 2/3 of $1 billion was also allocated towards fleet turnover. So the state of California has put out a lot of funding to support the environmental initiatives historically. We estimated it was probably about 10% of the total cost of all the rules that were passed during that time. So it wasn't like, you know, the state paid for all the costs of that fleet turnover. The industry did bear like 90% of it. And the financial support does continue into the future. We're now really, you know, beyond things that are federally approved, you know, new internal combustion engines, and really trying to push the barriers on zero emission technology, battery electric and hydrogen, and to some extent hybridization.
Okay, any more questions? If not, join me in thanking our panel, and we have a lot more work to do in case anybody hasn't noticed. So with that, I think we're a little bit off schedule here, but on my agenda it says we're going to talk about what we do next. So I don't know, Jerry, if you want to lead that.
After today's panel, we got a lot to do. And really, I think we discussed individually that maybe our every 2-year schedule needs to be pushed up to something a little more frequent.
Every week?
But I think we need to take that home and discuss it and see if it's realistic for each of us. But I viewed this whole trip and the agenda as a beginning of a severe and short-term, fast-paced education for the Washington State Transportation Commission as we get engaged in the whole AV regulations and moving forward. Having a better understanding that I think I gained over the last 2 days is important, and somehow we need to get government to move faster than normal. And so we can work together on getting these things implemented in a timely and coordinated fashion.
Can I add one thing that, sorry, can I?
Yeah.
So one thing that we have developed as the Urban Freight Lab in this area is we have an annual tech day where we get so many, you know, requests, both the city and we as SCTL, from tech companies who have solutions, who's you know, who want to show us how they're going to be helpful with urban freight problems. But it's, you know, for the city, it's just sort of a wave that they aren't resourced to respond to. And so as topical experts, what we do is vet those ideas, sort of have a competition. We prioritize some types of solutions, and then we bring in venture capital. We have those tech companies present. We bring in the city, and it's, you know, helps concentrate that into a specific thing every year with a little bit of filtering and some experts from sort of both the financing and the technology and the problem areas to spend a day together talking about those. So it's been a thing that's worked on this technology side for the city, at least for the last couple of years for us.
And I think I've been sitting here too and looking at our overall scope of what we do, and we've had a lot of focus on urban areas. And especially with freight, I think we need to look at those rural components that, you know, I-90 goes through a lot of rural areas. I-5 goes through a lot of rural areas. I think 75% of the freight that comes in from the Pacific Rim that is imported really goes down I-5, but the 25% that's going across I-90 to distribution centers on the northern tier is huge. And I have personal reason to be concerned about our grain growers, our tree fruit industries, and where efficiency is extremely important, especially to the soft fruits like cherries. So I think we need to make sure we don't miss those opportunities in looking at what these efficiencies can mean from bigger perspective.
Thank you. Tammy, do you want to add?
Sure, I do. I'm grateful to California. Thank you for hosting us. A couple of years ago when we got together, we wondered, should we meet again annually? And I think maybe it was you, Bob, who mentioned maybe we should meet every year. And I think that we should revisit whether or not this is an annual occurrence. I would love to hear what is happening year out with your research and ways in which we can maybe not duplicate, but replicate. And so the policies that we are all looking at in order to be able to facilitate new technology coming online and ways in which our states encourage new ways of doing business. I think the more that we can do that aligned, whether that's the removal of regulations, creation of regulations, or policies that we are either legislatively or through our commissions create, can either really make that go forward in a meaningful way for business. So the more continuity that we have and we share, I think would be critical to that success. So my hope is that we encourage this conversation and continue. I certainly would be open to talking with my commission about the opportunity for us to travel to Washington next year. And I do like the focus on rural as well, because while we do have large urban areas, or large for us in Oregon, most of our state is rural and an important part of our economy. Thank you.
That's great. So I think to wrap up, what I'd like to do is suggest we do a speed dating closing. So let's start, I don't care, we can start to my left or my right. Chris, maybe do you want to start? And anybody add if you want to add, or just say, I'm with everybody else.
I'll be quick. Madam Chair, I like the idea of an annual meeting. It's something we should consider. And, that has to happen at, the executive officer level. I'm very interested in following up on the innovations panel that we heard earlier today. So many issues there. I'd love us to do a workshop, as was suggested, the way we did on electrification and autonomy a couple of years ago. So that's something I would view as a major takeaway from these 2 days.
Madam Chair, I think I exactly echo what Commissioner Kehoe said.
Thank you. Paul's good? We're good?
I'd just like to make a comment. I think of all the meetings we've had together, this one has been the most interesting and the most informative that we've had.
Kind of as the new kid on the block, I've really appreciated what I've heard here today. One thing that concerns me is, and I understand the focus is much on metro urbanized areas, but we can't leave rural areas behind. I mean, I live in a rural area and have worked there for my career, but the problems there are similar, but the scale is smaller. But given that, we still have to find solutions. So thank you, California, for hosting.
Thank you, guys. It's been awesome meeting with all of you, and I agree with Commissioner Galmetti. This is, I don't think we can spend enough time on looking at future trends and trying to prepare. As I said, government is not nimble at this, so if we can figure out how to be nimble in the exception to the rule, that is awesome. I also want to note that when you deal with a state like California with a population of almost 40 million people, but then you look at Washington with 7 million, Oregon with 4 million. We have counties that are bigger than some of these states, right? But 95% of the state of California, of their 100 million acres, is in rural areas. 5% of our state is dedicated to commercial, industrial, and residential development for that 40 million. So your point on rural, especially when we have 400,000 miles of roads, I think is important. And we tend to focus on how to make the areas that are the most impactful when you're looking at climate change issues, et cetera. But we can't forget, and I like what Mr. Gilmetti said last time we met, that we have to look at edge development and how to interface with that. So as big as California is, I learned a lot from my other sister states, and I thank you for that opportunity to learn and from each other. It's been really awesome. So on to the next meeting.
So, let me just say, wow, this was a great meeting. A lot of great information. As I see it, if we wait 2 years, then we're behind the 8 ball
Exactly.
at that point. This needs to be every year, especially at this time of, in history or whatever, as we go through. I want to thank California for hosting. Great meeting again. Outstanding dinner. I don't know how we're going to top it. And we welcome you guys to come to the God's country. Okay?
I just want to thank you guys for hosting, like Roy said, and well, I think the where we're at on the circulation is it's Washington's turn to host, so let's think about doing that next summer, and maybe even consider getting you over to Eastern Washington if you really want to venture to Spokane or something, Joe. I think you could get exposed to a whole different side of Washington that you don't normally see when we're always in the urban congested area of Seattle, which we love, but might be an interesting freight opportunity and some other topics we could tease out if you guys don't mind taking a little extra flight over to Eastern Washington. So something to think about. That's right. Central Washington. Yeah, Moses Lake. Yeah. Yeah, maybe we could get a little tour of that or something.
Okay.
Jerry and Joe will be on point.
I just want to take the opportunity to thank the Oregon and Washington staff for working with us on developing this agenda, and I want to just thank all the speakers that were here today and yesterday, and also the Momentum, Randy Iwasaki and his team. And just most importantly for me is Garth Hopkins. Just greatly appreciate everything that he did. And I would also be remiss not to also thank Doug Remedios, who I don't see here right now. But yeah, and the one thing I don't want to end on a note of, but I need to give just a tone of caution in my role. In order to get our commissioners to Washington, I need approval from the governor's office, and so I will be seeking that shortly. And yeah, and maybe I know I have people here that will help me in that regard. But so look forward to our next meeting.
Yeah, I want to echo all the thanks for all the hard work to put this together as well. It's been great. I have a huge to-do list. Tammy's been passing me notes. We have plans I think we need to go back and look at again and make sure they're all synced up with all this innovation. I just want to remind that we have a letter to sign for 3 chairs. So thank you again, everyone.
I think it was a great, this was, having been at all of these since the outset of these, I think this was the best one. I agree with Commissioner Gilmetti. In terms of Eastern Washington, as one who was born there and spent my childhood there, I wouldn't go to Moses Lake necessarily. But Spokane, yeah, Spokane's great. Just one suggestion for our commission, since we're in the throes now of putting together the annual report. I think for me, the discussion on the innovation drives right to the heart of some of the comments I made last night at the close of our meeting, and I think we should try to incorporate some of that into our annual report. It will probably make the report more it'll make it more viable and relevant to what we're trying to accomplish. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming and hosting and making this so smooth and interesting. I think something that has been resonating with me was the comment from the extraordinary Joshua about the goal isn't just to put more transit on the ground, it's to increase mobility, and transit happens to be one of the best ways to do that. And I've been thinking about that a lot in the context of autonomous vehicles and thinking how we first set up the livable, vibrant communities we want to see, and then look to see how AVs can play a piece of the kind of big and vast transportation system that help get us there. So that's my takeaway.
Yeah, I'd like to echo everybody's sentiments. I want to appreciate and thank the California and Washington for joining myself and my fellow Oregonian colleagues on this trip. And I'm actually just very inspired about what's to come in the transportation system. I believe the opportunities are endless, and it's exciting, but it's also kind of frightening because we don't know where we're going or what's going to happen or what change is going to be popping up or what new technology will hit us tomorrow. So, but obviously we're dealing with major issues today in our transportation system, and I'm just excited to see what the future holds in terms of what we do to make more of a sustainable ecosystem for this country.
I just want to say I agree with the other commissioners' comments that this has been most informative, listening to disruptive technology and the fact that change is happening so very quickly. All this is real time. I really enjoyed the perspectives on both days, and I really appreciate the input from our fellow commissioners from Oregon and Washington as well. So thank you very much for making this, as Mr. Gilmetti said, probably one of the best joint meetings. I know our collective staffs from Oregon, Washington, and California will continue to work together in between wherever and whenever the next meeting is, because it's very important that we as commissioners stay informed, and the staff really makes the glue that keeps us all together. And then I'll just conclude and say, in the spirit of innovations in transportation, for those of you that want to stick around for the beginning of the California Commission meeting, which starts shortly, item 14 on the agenda is going to share how the reopening of Highway 1 took place after a major landslide took it out. It's very fascinating. Thank you again for Oregon and Washington participating.
Thanks. So, of course, I echo all the other commissioners' comments about how interesting and helpful this meeting is, and I've really appreciated the focus, just limiting the focus to a couple topics. And I've been doing some reading lately about the pace of change, and the data assured me that it's not just because I'm getting older that it seems like it's going so much faster. It really is logarithmically increasing, and one of the ways we can deal with that is this kind of cross-pollination and hearing from each other and sharing data. So thank you.
echo what everyone is saying. It was a very informative meeting today. I certainly learned a lot, and it's always good to hear from Oregon and Washington because we have a lot of similar problems, even though we have some that are somewhat different, but very important for us to work together to solve them. And our staff have really done an excellent job. The program was excellent, and I look forward to the next meeting.
My new friend Bob would like me to speak for him as well. I thought this was excellent and echo what we've heard from our colleague commissioners from all three states. And we have, I think, a very important opportunity not only to work together more closely, but to show intrastate cooperation that I would hope would be a model. So for the left coast to start this process, I think is a good thing. And to move it forward. And I would concur with colleagues who believe this would be better done on an annual basis rather than waiting 2 years as we have for this.
Okay, so we're going to wrap this up. I think in closing, just once again to thank Garth and Doug, because really an awful lot of work goes in advance and ongoing to make it all flow smoothly and to have the quality of discussions that we had, so it doesn't go unnoticed. So thank you and to all of our staff, because I know everybody was engaged. And I think Congressman DeSaulnier really kind of set it up for us yesterday when he said, well, you know, in D.C. we kind of look at the West Coast and say, well, who knows? And Commissioner Burke could speak to that, having served our country in D.C. But I think it is a wonderful opportunity for us to be better together and to learn and to work efficiently. We all have limited resources, and I would just encourage our staff on an ongoing basis. Let's share info. All of our meetings are recorded, so y'all can watch us and enjoy the dialogue that goes on. Yeah, Paul, everybody's going to be watching you, so behave over there. But it's great for all of us, so let's all just give a shout out to the fact that we got together, and we'll figure out how quickly we can get together again. So thank you, and meeting is adjourned. Oh, I forgot public comment. Forgive me. Thank you. Keeping me straight and narrow. I was getting a little hungry, but that's okay. Public is important. So we have anybody? Okay, my apologies. I was remiss in not putting that, but thanks to my commissioners who keep me in line. So thank you all, and now I will close the meeting.